You are all at home today.
It's Wednesday.
No reason. The weather, the war, what else? Come? Ah, that's why. I cannot see. Which kind of is skunk? Freddo, caldo. Qui sono freddo. Ma non c'è il telecomando. Arriva caldo. Un ufficio congelato. Qui pure, madonna. Che arriva? Eh? Come la becco sul collo. Now, the issue we shall afford today is related to market failures, which are relevant for the market. And in a way, they justify the intervention, the public intervention in the market for health. Now, possibly I have already mentioned that in general, the theory of market failures talk about market failure in all those cases in which one of the assumptions of perfect competition doesn't work or cannot be applied to the current system. Can you see? Yes, you can. And in particular, which are the market failure that we can find in the market for health? Well, look at first at the assumptions which are relevant for perfect competition. We should already know what I'm talking about, but just to remind them, they are free entry and exit from the market. Perfect information from by part of all the individuals participating in the market. Homogeneous goods, which is exchanged. The number of buyers and suppliers must be very high. No one of them, either on the consumer side or on the supply side, must have monopoly, any kind of power on the determination of prices. Moreover, there must not be relevant externalities, either positive or negative, in the market. Possibly not public good, but we will see that public goods, even the pure type of Samuelson, can be introduced in the perfect competitive market. And what else? No natural monopoly exists, which means that we don't have increased return to scale on the production side. Now, look at the situation in which there's nice condition that guarantee quite good result of the market do apply in the market for health. Well, the first situation that we can find, which is, we have already talked about it, are the existence of barrier to entry. And this is quite important in a healthcare market because barrier to entry in the health market are in general related to the quality of product that must be exchanged. For instance, when we talked about of licensed law, are exactly those that want, for instance, for entering in the market or for selling medicines in the market, are exactly those laws that in a way guarantee a given amount, a certain level of quality of the good. I'm going to be frozen now. The quality of the good. And in this case, this means if we do need, like, in order to product means that the product itself is not homogeneous. And in principle, you can think of most of the goods and services that are sold in the market for health as goods which are not homogeneous, exactly because the quality of the good is important and makes the difference. Another point that, another assumption that is not satisfied is that related to numerosity of sellers and consumers. We have already seen that it might not be the case because the number of firms might be small. And so it might not be the case of natural monopoly, but we can quite often find situations of imperfect competition or with a different degrees of monopoly. We have already mentioned the situation in which the motivation for supplier or patient are not strictly rational, and this holds for on the consumer side when they ask for the cure, but it might also be the case in for supply. Finally, there are an important amount of cases, most of which are of relative interest for us because they affect those systems in which the market is maintained, and are all those issues related to asymmetric information and uncertainty, where the market for health, in that case, even if it wants, if someone wants to guarantee that the healthcare service is supplied with a market system, you have to deal with insurance problem and different degree of uncertainty or asymmetric information among players is also an important issue for that. Finally, public good and externalities are situations in which we shall enter in deep very soon. Now, of course, we shall not consider all of those point that I mentioned, we shall look only at some failure of the market. But before entering into the point that will be on which we'll stick for a certain number of lectures, just let me say that as opposed in a way to the theory of market failure that justify the public intervention in the market, there exists also a theory of government or state failures that support the view that in those cases in which government or public economy enters into the market in order to correct the failure due to the market itself, it might reach results which can be even worse than those that is what's going to correct. What I mean, for instance, consider the case that we see last in one of the first lecture, and it was related to the monopoly power that could be used even in those cases in which there are no reason for a natural monopoly. And what happens? Why we could talk about a market failure? We had a perfectly elastic long-term supply function, which does not justify monopoly. We have a demand curve with a negative slope, which is quite standard, but the supplier are in the position, in this case, of determining the price by maximizing the profit, which means that they are in the position of choosing the quantity, marginal energy, or choosing the quantity that maximizes the profit. And as the supply represents the segment in which marginal cost is equal to average cost, the monopolist will choose that price in which marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So it will choose QM, which is the quantity that maximizes profit. And so he can sell the considered good at a price PM, which is much higher than the marginal cost, which is also the competitive price, which would be applied in this situation if we were in a situation of perfect competition. Now, what can the government do in this situation? Might be one of the options is that of having the power itself, the government, of making the price, just choosing situations which are different from that of profit maximization. And so, for instance, restore the situation of perfect competition that induces the equilibrium in EC, which is the perfect competitive price for which the willingness to pay of consumer, I call it PC, is equal to the marginal cost, which expanding this situation and with respect to a numeraire, you should already know the situation of perfect competitive market means that, for instance, the marginal rate of substitution of a subject in the market, of a subject A in the market between the good Q and the good, I call it K, is equal to the marginal rate of substitution of subject J between Q and K, and because the price is equal to the marginal cost, with respect to one numeraire, the marginal cost of the numeraire, it also equal, this equality is also equal to the marginal rate of transformation between the goods Q and good K, okay? So government could restore, with using its own power in this market, the situation of perfect competitive market. Why the government might fail in this operation, which apparently says, if you look at the picture, it leads to a situation which must be preferred, because QC equilibrium, the competitive equilibrium quantity is much higher than the monopolistic quantity. The price is much lower, but and so the efficiency of the market is restored in point EC. What might happen? The point that makes this situation critical, or at least not cannot be considered as a long run solution, is that, for instance, situation of bounded rationality or adjustment, dynamic adjustment. It means that over time, government is affected by bureaucracy, or which determines an increase of marginal and average cost, might induce in time an increase of cost, which might be of various types, which is not immediate, but after a certain time, bureaucracy or bounded rationality of public management determines a situation in which at first the cost, the supply function can be shifted to S prime, or even much higher than the PM price, so that the gain is not guaranteed. Well, we shall not consider, of course, the failure of the state, because you have to look at first the role of the state, but you have to remind that a theory alternative to that of market failure do exist, and in most fields is even quite well justified. If you think of, for instance, you are all Italian, I think. If you think of the situation of Italian supply of air care services, which is organized at a regional level, in most cases you can see clearly the difference in price and better in cost, different cost of production of the good. And in most cases, you can also perceive, possibly, I don't know how much you are following these issues, you can perceive that the higher costs of the public sector are mainly due to bureaucratic costs. Not only, but in part, they are such. Anyway, go back to our situation, in which we have to consider the main market failures of interest for health. And we shall consider three situations in which do not capture all the possible situations, but definitely they capture the most important issues for health. And the first group that we shall consider are those market failures related to the supply side, which includes, first, in the analysis, the presence of pure public goods as a kind of indivisibility which is relevant for the market. And then it looks at the supply condition or the transaction condition that are related to indivisibility. I shall explain it in a minute. Then the second issue that we shall consider, not today, because this lecture takes quite a long time, is the situation of market failures on the demand side. Well, you can possibly get the point in which the market fails on the supply function, which is in all those situations in which perfect competitive conditions do not exist, which are mainly related to production side, which means natural monopolies or indivisibility on the side of transaction or production function. What is less evident is the part related to the failure of the demand side, which you have already heard about it. Why can we say that the consumer that is assumed to be rational and who is assumed to know everything is good or bad for him fails when choosing in the market something that he wants to consume? That's not a rhetoric question, no, even for Toda. Why do you think we have a situation in which, well, I'm the consumer, I'm perfect rational, I maximize my utility function as rational consumers, as rational consumers do, but I fail for some reason. And this is only strictly related to the demand side. Can you think of a situation that involves you? Any idea, even at home? When you as consumer fails in consuming, buying something under the assumption that you are rational, perfect informed, and you are in a competitive market, but you fail. So the first thing to be defined is what failures of the consumer means. How can I say that I'm failing in choosing what I want when maximize my utility? Any idea? So you go to the market, buy something. Think of whatever you can buy. And then speak up. You are perfectly informed, so you can choose where to buy it. Well, it's not so obvious because it involves all the situation in which the decision is a dynamic decision, which is quite often, of course, because actually it's not always the case that you go in the market and consume immediately what you buy. But there are some things that you have to plan. You must, for the consumption, they require a consumer plan, which involves a number of time or whatever size, days, week, months, year. And we can say that the consumer has failed in taking this kind of decision of consumption, even when it's perfectly informed about all the options in the market and he buys at best price, your cases. When he is informed, but he has to buy ex ante and he realized ex post the satisfaction of the good. And what might happen that time length over which the consumer evaluated satisfaction from consumption, makes me think that that decision wasn't too good. We call in this situation that that kind of decision, I mean, that decision taken ex ante about a plan of consumption that involves a number of years, months, or weeks, is not time consistent. And this might happen for different reasons. For instance, because whatever you consider, say, security plans, or even what you buy planning for a certain quite long period, you are not in principle the same person that took the decision ex ante. So when you go to consume what you buy, you are not longer the same person, and something has changed. And one situation that we can find mainly on health is that, well, if I have known what I would have been in future, I had taken a different decision about this plan of consumption. And all those decisions that are affected by time inconsistency, which are dynamic decisions, it means that the consumer is not maximizing and simultaneously consume, but is maximizing. There is process of dynamic maximization, and so it implies a number of time for which that the result manifests its effect does not work. And for instance, another situation that involves market failure on the demand side is that, which is very important for health, which now is called in the Handbook of Health Economics of Parts. So rational people know that smoking, drinking, alcohol, junk food, gaming, what else? They have five, I missed some. Drugs are dangerous for health, but they cannot avoid in their plan of consumption to spend their money and maximize their utility for the immediate satisfaction determined by smoking, drinking, and the like. As well as the opposite. There are a number of situations in which people do not fully realize that in future, for instance, all the positive events related to preventive medicines, vaccination or the like, is something that might have consequences in future. So one of the main discussions related to Novax was related to the fact that those to be convinced, there were those that say, well, I'm not sure about the vaccination, and in the hope that the pandemic passes before I'm infected, I hope not to be infected and wait. And then after a while, they realized, possibly because they were infected, they realized that the effect of not being vaccinated was the worst in principle. You have seen all those cases of people, famous Novax, that then were infected and died. And they talked to people saying, well, if I had known, well, they actually knew, but in that context, their decision ex ante was not the correct one. And it's not always an issue, issues of perfect rationality, but also an issue of what we call the aprasia, or uncertainty under control. But we will enter into these details in future lectures. last point that we shall afford is that considers jointly both failures of the market, both on supply side and demand side, that present jointly in the market. Which is the situation? This situation is that in which we observe that, for instance, we are in a market that instead of guarantee reasonable distribution of income after everything, any equilibrium is reached, we observe in the distribution of income that there is, say, a very high number of people or share of population that is below the threshold of poverty, and a small number of people which is very rich. So on an equal distribution of income in general signal that something in the market hasn't worked, and this might become an important for health issue of market intervention. Well, actually, one of you, I don't remember who, justified public intervention and the market for health in the first lecture, exactly because of redistributive issues, which are those situations in which government should intervene in order to correct some market failure. And indeed, the kind of market failure that we are going to correct are those mainly related to joint failures from the demand and supply side that determines an equal distribution of income and an equal opportunity to enter in the market for health, for which government intervention is required. Now, in principle, these are the main three issues that we shall consider to justify public finance, to look at the point of view of public finance and market for health. But of course, are not all the full. They do not capture all the cases of market failure. For example, I'm teaching public finance, not for health, to undergraduate. And another important situation of market failure is that due to macroeconomic conditions, which is the situation in which the market economy is altered because of exogenous shock. Say, now there is a war in Ukraine, and the market price for gas, electricity, and the like is exploding in a way, like the war. And this is a situation which is under control of the market itself and also of the government itself. But if you look, well, I didn't want to assimilate the pandemic to a situation of macroeconomic failures. But if you look at it, and you consider that a failure of macroeconomic indicators, which is exogenous to the market, determines the need for government intervention, you can possibly easily assimilate the pandemic to a shock of the market of this kind. Because if you look at all those measures taken by different governments in Europe or in the United States, occurred because of the pandemic, which was not a simple shock of exogenous shock of prices or the like, but the kind of measure undertaken by government was exactly similar to those determined, for instance, by the war now, and before the pandemic by the very huge crisis that we observed beginning in the States at the end of 2007. So in a way, anyway, we shall not consider this kind of failure, so I stopped talking about it. And what we want to do now is entering into the market failure on the supply side. The first thing, you shall find that this picture, which I find very nice, also in Moodle. So it is in the outline of the course where you will find out the lecture. But what is represented here is the way in which we are trying to capture the situation of market failures on the supply side, which are relevant for the healthcare system, which are relevant actually not only for health, but also more generally for public economics or for public intervention in the market. Now, the main point that you will find in chapter, I don't know the number of chapter, but it's written somewhere, I think it's chapter, I haven't written anywhere, of the book Principle of Public Economics. The chapter is called Public Wants and Public Goods, something like this, which is calling, is also the chapter relevant is in Moodle. The first things that we have to consider is the fact that we are moving into those situations in which the issue of indivisibility is quite relevant. We'll see on the demand side, but finally on the supply side. And the first things that we have to consider is how relevant is the issue of indivisibility in presence of pure public goods of Samuelsonian type, for which, for instance, non-rivalry and non-excludability work. This is a kind of indivisibility of the goods, given that one unit of good can be enjoyed simultaneously by an indeterminate number of consumers simultaneously, by the way. So consumers do not hurt each other. The second issue of indivisibility, which is relevant in the presence of pure public goods, is that of non-excludability. In those situations in which public goods, pure public goods are present, we are not able to exclude individuals who do not pay the price, the correct price as in the market. So how can be this situation of public good be, in a way, reconducted into a framework that considers which, departing from the homogeneous type of good, also keep into consideration the fact that other than indivisibility for goods, pure public goods, there are also stronger indivisibility on the production side and transaction side. Now, this is where the picture enters and becomes relevant, but I want to simplify it because we shall look at the main situation. Look, before the simple situation, what I'm going to draw on the board is a situation that helps us to understand how indivisibility on the production side, which means when the good is produced, and on the transaction side, which means when the good is distributed to consumers, affect the competitive equilibrium. Okay, so this is a broad form that consider is the reference table that considers various situations, but and how it considers how the picture of the standard competitive market changes when we are in presence of indivisibilities, which are also related at the existence of pure public goods. What happens now? We in this picture we have the production side, which is divided into two broad areas in which we distinguish the situation in which the production of the goods is divisible, which means I'm allowing a number of suppliers to produce that kind of good exactly as in the perfect competitive system. So in this case of maximum divisibility, I am supporting the view that a number of producers are in the position of producing the good, whatever it is. Okay? Only the production. The maximum indivisibility is that situation for which only one producer is technologically allowed to produce the good efficiently. And this is, by the way, the situation that economists call perfect natural monopoly, which is different from the kind of monopoly power that we considered at the beginning. So in this case, these two cases, maximum divisibility of the production size means that this producer of the same goods. And the case of maximum indivisibility, I need only one to be efficient in order to produce the amount of good in that market. Okay, this is not the only point for identifying the market failure on the supply side, because another point that is necessary, because if we deal also with more or less pure public good, is how the good, once supplied, reach the consumers. And in particular, whether the good can be sold to consumers in units of sale, which is with a degree of maximum divisibility, like 1 gram of whatever, or we are on the transaction size in the presence of maximum indivisibility, which is exactly that situation for which simultaneously the consumer are in the position of consuming the units of good that are provided, and they do not disturb each other. So as you can see, we have two opposite situations of maximum divisibility, where we have, which is this situation, but I show you better with an example with few consumer and few suppliers, in which we have, in this case, I can see, n suppliers and m consumers, and they meet in the market and exchange the good. The equilibrium solution is given when the demand, the aggregate demand is equal to the supply, where the aggregate supply is given by the sum of the goods supplied by each individual producer, and the aggregate demand is given by the aggregation of the individual demand of the M consumer. And this equation represents equilibrium that we will see in a minute. The other extreme cases is that in which we have maximum indivisibility on both production and transaction side, which is this situation here, where on the production side, we have the situation of natural monopoly, where one supplier is enough for guarantee efficiency of the production of that good considered. Moreover, there is maximum indivisibility on the transaction side, so both non-rivalry and non-excludability works, and so all the goods supplied in this market can be jointly consumed by different individuals. In order to understand, then we have all those mixed cases that are more common and more in the market for health. But now, in order to understand the issues, we shall refer to a much simple situation in which, with the demand and supply function, you can understand what is the difference. So, consider only the same case. We have production here and transaction, and then we have, no, it's too small anyway, max divisibility, and max indivisibility. Now consider the situation in which we have, we now look at, I want to arrive to make you understand how public goods differentiated from pure private goods. So assume that the supply function here, sorry, is given by the sum of the n supply function in the market. We have the supply perfectly divisible. But we have only two consumers here in order to understand, say, in equilibrium, the demand D of subject A plus the demand for subject B, which are the only two consumers in this market. So I aggregate this demand of the only two consumers in this market must be equal to the supply in this market. What does it mean in this situation? Excludability and rivalry. It means that given the supply, well, I cannot exclude who doesn't pay. Well, unethical conduct is not allowed, so you cannot think of this in market. So if you want to consume, you have to buy a price for it. But what does excludability mean in this situation? It means that if the supply of this good is equal to S, this is S, and if subject A enters in the market and buys all S, what consumer B is allowed to consume is just that left to him by subject A. So subject B can consume, given the supply function, only what is left after A has bought the good. Okay? Which is the reason why these goods are rival. So this justifies also the fact that the demand the individual demand of subject A, I call the A and say DB. For reaching that equilibrium, sum up horizontally, which means that I sum quantity of the goods for which there is willingness to pay, positive willingness to pay by consumers. So if I want to find the aggregate demand in this case, I sum the two demand. So I fix a price equal to 0, and I look at the quantity that individual A and individual B are willing to buy. So this is QA when P is equal to 0, and this is QB when P is equal to 0, and when P is equal to 0, when the aggregate demand, the quantity quantity demanded is equal to the sum of the quantity of B plus the quantity of A. So which means that I have to sum up this bit to the demand, the quantity demanded by B, more or less at each point here. Then I fix another point. I have two demand curves, they are linear. So I only need 2 points in order to find the aggregate demand. So I fix a good point like this, a good price like P star, P at, and this for this price, the quantity demanded by A is 0, whereas the quantity demanded by B is positive, and it's this one. This is Q at B. So I sum 0 to Q at B, and I have here the second point of the aggregate demand. And by joining this point, I can obtain the aggregate demand. And if you want to check that thing is correct, when you have, say, the supply curve like this, what happens? The equilibrium is here, where, and is the yellow Q is the aggregate equilibrium on the competitive system. But also you can see the individual quantity consumed by the two individuals, which is QB E, this one. And Q A E, and in order to check whether the picture is correct, what happens is that the sum of these plus this must end up in point E, which means that this is equal to this. Okay. What happens in this situation of perfect competitive system? It happens that if this is the supply function for which the price is for which represents the marginal cost and the average cost, and the willingness to pay of the consumer is representative of a process of utility maximization. I have at equilibrium that the price, the willingness to pay of consumer is equal to the marginal cost, which implies that, as I mentioned before, the marginal rate of substitution for subject A between good Q and the numerator, I call it N, is equal to the marginal rate of substitution for subject B between the good Q and the numerator, which is also equal to the price in equilibrium, and PE, which is also equal if I divide the marginal cost of production of this good for the marginal cost of the numerator, the ratio between the two marginal costs, which in turn is equal to the ratio by the various productivity of factors, but leave it, is also equal to the marginal rate to the marginal rate of transformation between good Q and the numerator N. Okay, and this is the condition that guarantees Pareto efficiency in the market, and which represents this equilibrium here. Okay. Now consider the situation in which, only from the consumer, only the transaction side, in which, well, the supply, whatever it is, it can be produced by, the good can be produced by an individual, which is maximum in divisibility. So we have the sum of X, D, S. And there is maximum indivisibility from the on the consumer side, which means that there is no rivalry and non-excludability when in the consumption. What does change in this situation as for the demand for goods by part of the individual? Well, in principle, it means that each individual is demanding for the goods, say individual A demand DA for this good, does not affect the demand of the others. So once the good is supplied, both individual A and individual B can fully consume the good produced. What this condition means that the supply is equal to, once is given, there is non-excludability, because whatever amount of this supply is consumed by individual A, also individual B, even all it, also individual B can consume exactly the same amount of this good. And this change enough the story. The first thing that changes is how the demand is formed, the aggregate demand is formed in this market. because in those cases in which non-excludability and non-rivalry exist, the aggregate demand is obtained by summing up the price vertically, and the equilibrium is found such that we have a unique quantity of equilibrium which is given by the quality between demand and supply. But all the individuals have to consume that amount supplied in the market. What do I mean? You can see it better if I do a picture in which we have the individual demand DA for a public good, which is my preference for a given good, and the individual B has a different demand. It likes more that good, so that DB is its own demand curve. In this case, if I want to buy, if I want to know the aggregate demand in this market, I have to sum up the two demand curves vertically, which means that I sum up prices or horizontally, or I fix a quantity, say Q equal to 0, this point, and look at the willingness to pay of each consumer for that good. Okay, so when Q is equal to 0, individual A is willing to pay PA Q equal to 0, and individual B is willing to pay PB Q equal to 0. And in order to aggregate these two, I sum up the price vertically. So I sum up this price PA to this price PB, and more or less I reach this point, which is PA plus PB when Q is equal to 0. Okay, then I fix another price, which is very another quantity, say Q out, and look, I fix it, given I can choose that they are linear, whatever point I take is good, but very easy for calculation, because when if I stop at Q out, I have that the willingness to pay of individual A is equal to 0, and I sum up 0 to the willingness to pay of subject B, which is this one. This is Q B, Q at B. Okay, now I am in the position of, so I sum 0 to Q at B, and I stay here. And so I can draw the aggregate demand for a public good. Now look at what happens in equilibrium. This is the demand curve. When we were in the market before, private market, we have the situation in which each individual goes to the market, buy a certain amount of goods, pay the same unit price for that good, which is divisible. So you can buy 10 apple, 20 apple, or whatever. and you pay for it at the same unit price, which is equal to PE, and you take the good, go home and consume it. Okay? What happens in the situation in which we are in presence of pure public good for which the demand is in that way? The aggregate demand is the, which color is this? Blue, no, it's not blue, this light blue. And assume that the supply function is the yellow one, this one. Is a supply function. Now, the equilibrium is given, the pink, not the light blue, is the D dot, the aggregate demand for a pure public good, and the supply function is the yellow line, which is, in this way, means that we are in a perfectly elastic, long-run, competitive supply curve. So the equilibrium is found at the point in which total demand and total supply meet. This is the point is that A, where it determines QE, which is a property. We are in a market of pure public goods. So remind the situation in which if this QE is the supply, is the quantity supplied of this good, both individual can consume QE in full, which means that it is equal to, say, QEA, and it might be equal to QEB, because each individual can consume in full all the production of the public, pure public goods. The point is that the relevant point in the presence of public goods that the consumption of these goods is such that it cannot be excluded who doesn't pay, which means that when you are consuming a public good, you are barely required to pay a price. For instance, in the area of the benefit fallout, the view of Colosseo can be a public good. But you cannot imagine that someone put a ticket for all those that want to see the Colosseum view from the road, because it's much more expensive to put a price than, or imagine something that covers and disappears just when you pay a ticket. No, it seems something quite funny and definitely very expensive. So given this, that is, given that those consumers who do not pay cannot be excluded, there is a shift between the moment in which consumers can consume the good and the moment in which they have to pay or might want to pay for that good. And this poses an important issue that is known in the literature as free riding problem. Free riding problem means that either A or B, that both can have the possibility of consuming the public good up to the amount QE, say after they have consumed, well, I'm not willing to pay because I was not interested in it. And I can do it because I am not, nobody is in the position of making them pay, and otherwise they leave without the consumption of the good. Another example is the lights or the illumination of the town at night. It might be dark or might be illuminated, but it's quite difficult to say, well, you are consuming at night, you are going exactly in that place to read your book at night, so you save money at home, and you have to pay something that is not even conceivable. And so one of the issues is, in this case, is how much each individual should pay for the consumption of public good, given that nobody is in the condition of make the payment compulsory or the payment when individual consume that good. Well, from this picture, we can have a kind of signal of which kind of division of the expenditure could be done in this market, because if you look at point A, you can see that this line joining a point A with QA, this red line, intersect both the demand QB, DB and DA at a given point. For instance, so it intersects DB at point, I call it BEB, and it intersects DA at point BEA. So what would happen if I was in the position of making individual A and B pay according to their individual willingness to pay? Could I be in the position of making the system working in that what I'm in charge to making individuals play is able to cover the cost of production of the pure public good? So if you look at this situation, if I ask to individual A to pay a price, individual price equal to PEA, this unit price, and I multiply this unit price for the quantity maximum consumed by the individual A according to his preference. Price times quantity gives the amount that is individual A would be willing to pay for the public good considered. Then if I go to individual B, and I see that individual B at equilibrium QE is willing to pay for that good, a price which is equal to PB, which is this unit, this is the unit price. So if I multiply PB times QE, which is the equilibrium quantity, I could have the willingness to pay, overall willingness to pay of individual B for the consumption of public good, which is given by the rectangle bordered in light blue. So if I sum up what is willing to pay the individual B, this rectangle here, to what is willing to pay individual A, which is the red rectangle, as you can see, I can fully cover the price, the cost of production of pure public goods, which has quite interesting consequences in terms of equilibrium that we will see with other details when we introduce it into the perfect competitive market. It means that this condition, joined to the fact that the cost in equilibrium, the marginal cost, is equal to the willingness to pay P of subject A plus the willingness to pay of subject at equilibrium of subject B also means that given that the individual willingness to pay as before is the marginal rate of substitution of subject A between, I call this good Q, but it's a public good. I call it G. In order to distinguish from condition, I call G the good consider, not Q. Allora, PA is the marginal rate of substitution is equal in equilibrium to the marginal rate of substitution of subject A for good G and the numerator, and in this case, plus the marginal rate of substitution of subject B between the public good G to the marginal cost, which is in turn equal to the marginal rate of transformation between good G, public good, and the numerator N. It's clear? If this is clear, we will show it even in a different way. Then I will give you some example. Or possibly it's better if I give you some example before looking. No, I want to show you now how this situation can be represented in the competitive representation of the market. It means how this kind of good, which work in a quite funny way, quite odd way, no, funny is not nothing to be funny, but quite odd way, can be anyway introduced in the competitive equilibrium system. What I'm going to talk about is result obtained by Samuelson, for which he won the Nobel Prize, exactly for a paper explaining how this very funny odd types of goods can be also reconsidered with some difficulties, because on the financing side there are some problems, can be anyway reconsidered in a competitive system in which assume that we have allora, look at the situation. We are in a perfect competitive economy. And the first really things that we have to consider is the production frontier, in which, in this case, we have, instead of the standard case that you already know, which is that of two good, homogeneous good, we have a public good in the horizontal axis, public good, and private good in the vertical axis, for which all the property already said old. Now, Assume that the black one is the production possibility frontier in this economy, producing only one public good and only one private good. So if this is the marginal rate of substitution, of transformation between private good and public good, I called it, it means that the slope of this frontier is given by the marginal rate of transformation between, I call it this x, and this is called g as before, between x and g, okay, the slope of this frontier. Now, assume that in this economy, I have only two individuals, A and B, as before. And each individual is maximizing its own utility. And the utility of the individual are very simple. We have two individuals. OE is a function of simply X and G for both A and B. They are different from each other. And we want to see what an individual, what is the equilibrium result that can be reached in the present of this very odd good for which no rivalry and no excludability hold. So what is a way of solving this issue, this problem? Well, I have two individuals, only two, A and B. And assume one way for solving this problem is that we fix the utility of one individual. Each of them have an utility function UA and UB, depending on the vector of goods, which are only two, X and G. And say, I let A maximize its own utility given the utility of individual B fixed at a certain level. Okay, it is a way to find a solution. That is, I want to see how this market performs in the presence of two consumers, both consumer two goods, one of which is a public good with that funny property. Now, in order to see what happens in this market, what can I do? I fix, say, the utility of individual B, and this, given the indifference code of individual B, I fix a certain level, which represents UB at. And given the fixed utility of subject B, I maximize the utility of subject A. Okay, so it's a type of constrained maximization where individual A maximizes its utility subject to the budget constraint, but also subject to the utility of individual B is fixed at U at B. Okay. Now, what happens? What can A do in this context of maximization? So we have again good G and good X, private and public. So given the constraint of individual A to the utility, it wants to reach the best point after B has reached utility UB, which means that which represent all the point that of joint public good and private good that allow B to reach equal to U at B. So what can A consume in this market after having fixed B utility with the light blue. Now, I know that I have no problem for the public good because actually A can consume all the quantity of good which is supplied. Okay, but I know that we have seen before that as for the private good X, A can consume only the part that is left to it by individual B. So what is the extent, the quantity of private good that given this utility blue of individual B, A can consume? I can find the quantity of private good that A can consume. And the picture below, where I know that in the upper figure, at each point, well, if I'm in this point A, no, A is not the correct one because I have individual A. So I want B, no, C. C. At point C here, how much private good can be consumed by individual A? Can you see it in the picture? This is the situation in which the indifference curve of individual B intersected the possibility, the production possibility frontier. And if B is in this point here, it means that it has consumed all the good produced in this economy. So the difference between the maximum amount of private good produced by the system and the part of that good consumed by the individual B is zero. So at point C, individual A can consume zero. And I'm at this point here that corresponds to C above. And the same situation occurs in point D. In point D, is the situation in which now a much higher amount of public good G is produced by the system with respect to point C, but also all the amount possible of private good produced is again consumed by individual B, because in point D, the indifference curve of individual B intersected the production possibility frontier. Okay, so also in point D, the quantity of private good that can be consumed by individual A is zero. What about the other point, other possibility of consumption? For instance, if individual B was at this point and chose in its frontier of consuming this amount of public good and this amount of private good, how much of the private good can be consumed here by individual A? Well, as for public good, I have no problem, because if that is the production of public good, individual A can consume all of the full amount produced. Whereas, as for the private good, what A can consume is the difference between the maximum amount produced by the economic system represented in the frontier and what is being consumed by individual B. So this distance represents the possibility of consumption of private good by part of individual A when individual B consumes the amount equal to G of this good. So if I report here, I have another point of the possibility of consumption. And I can go on taking the difference between the frontier and the indifference curve fixed at the beginning of subject B, and having other point of individual B, of possibility of consumption. When, well, once having considered all the possible points, what happens at the end is that I can draw a curve like this, for which is called consumption possibility frontier for subject A, to not be confounded with the production possibility schedule of the upper figure, which says the possibility that subject A has in this market of consuming this good. Notice that, look, I forgot to tell you something, but that you already know. What is the slope of the indifference curve of subject B? You are expected to know it because it's the same, and it is independent of the type of good we are considering. The slope of the indifference curve is given by the marginal rate of substitution of subject B between X and G, which are respectively the private and public good. Okay, so in the directed curve down at the ground floor, this one, this by construction as exactly constructed, taking the difference between the production possibility frontier and the indifference curve, which means that the slope of the consumption possibility frontier, which is the red curve here, has a slope which is equal to the marginal rate of transformation between X and G, less the marginal rate of substitution of subject B between X and G. Okay, this is the slope of the consumption possibility frontier. Now, we can go at the end of the story, which is how individual individual A can find its optimal amount of consumption of good G and X. What do? We take the difference curve of individual, what a different color, green. I take the map of indifference curve of individual A, and I'm expecting that individual A will choose, given its indifference curve related to the consumption of G and X, I will choose that point in which the highest indifference curve is tangent to the consumption possibility frontier for him. And so this is the point, which says at the same time, which is that inside the competitive equilibrium, which is the amount of private and public good consumed by the two individuals in the market, that makes the equilibrium consistent with the competitive equilibrium, where, unlike the cases that we have already seen, this is unlike this story here, marginal rate of substitution of all the individual is the same and is equal to the price, which is equal to the marginal cost, which is equal to the marginal rate of transformation. In the case of pure public good, where we have that in equilibrium, given that the slope of the indifferent curve, this is UA, is equal to the marginal rate of substitution of subject A between X and G, we have found exactly the solution that we have seen before, where the marginal rate of transformation between X and G is equal to the sum of the marginal rate of substitution between X and G of subject B plus marginal rate of substitution of subject A between X and G, which is exactly the story that we have seen when we look at the issue from the demand point of view. This is exactly the equilibrium that we have found before, where the marginal rate of transformation, which is equal to the marginal cost, which is equal to, which must be equal to the sum of the individual willingness to pay for the quantity, for any given quantity of the goods, of the public good, and is in turn equal to the sum of the individual's marginal rate of substitution between public good and private good, which is exactly the condition that we have found here. Did you like this story? Is that clear?
Yeah.
Is that clear? Good.
Yeah.
Next time we will see some example of public good and the problem that we have in make the individual really willing to pay for the good consumed, and which are the solution given that the consumption of public good is independent of the moment of the payment for that good. So we have to find a solution for financing it inside the competitive market. Okay, see you soon. But
Thank
please,
you, Professor. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you,
stop
Rob.
me anytime that there is something that is not clear.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.
Thursday.
Bye.
Bye-bye.